Millionaire marries black Starbucks waitress on a bet and discovers a shocking secret. The crystal chandeliers of Manhattan's most exclusive social club, the Platinum Lounge, cast prismatic shadows across faces that had graced magazine covers and Forbes lists. It was that peculiar hour when old money met new tech, when third-generation wealth clinked glasses with Silicon Valley's finest, and when terrible ideas masqueraded as brilliant ones. Lawrence Norman, 32, with a jawline that belonged in vintage Hollywood and the kind of wealth that made headlines, was starting to feel the effects of his fourth glass of 25-year-old Macallan. The leather chair beneath him, worth more than most people's monthly rent, creaked as he shifted uncomfortably. Something about tonight felt different. The air was charged with an electricity that spelled trouble. Around him, the usual suspects lounged in their bespoke suits, trading stories about their latest acquisitions, islands, super yachts, tech startups. Chad Thompson, with his perfectly whitened teeth and carefully disheveled golden hair, was holding court. He'd just closed another billion-dollar deal, and the smugness radiating from him was almost radioactive. "You trust fund babies are all the same," Chad drawled, swirling his whiskey with practiced nonchalance. "You think you understand the real world, but when's the last time any of you actually talked to someone who takes public transport?" The group chuckled, that practiced laugh of the ultra-wealthy that never quite reached their eyes. But Chad wasn't finished. His gaze fixed on Lawrence with the precision of a sniper finding his target. "Take our friend Larry here," Chad continued, using the nickname he knew Lawrence despised. "Bet he couldn't last a month actually dating someone from the working class, too afraid it might tarnish the Norman family name." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The Norman family name carried weight, old money, blue blood, the kind of lineage that traced back to New York's founding fathers. Lawrence's grandfather had built half the skyscrapers piercing Manhattan's skyline, and his father had doubled the family fortune through shrewd investments. "You'd be surprised what I can do, Thompson," Lawrence replied, his voice carrying that dangerous edge that came from wounded pride and expensive scotch. Chad's smile widened like a shark scenting blood. "Care to make it interesting?" The other men leaned forward, the promise of entertainment drawing them in like moths to flame. These bets were legendary in their circle, multi-million-dollar wagers on everything from yacht races to corporate takeovers. "Name your terms," Lawrence said, even as a small voice in his head screamed at him to stop. Chad took his time, savoring the moment. $5 million. You have to marry someone from the service industry within 6 months. Stay married for a full year. He paused for dramatic effect. "And to make it really interesting, I get to pick the girl." The room erupted in low whistles and murmurs. This was entertainment at its finest. "Done," Lawrence said, before his better judgment could intervene. Chad's eyes glittered with malicious delight as he pulled out his phone, scrolling through something before turning the screen toward Lawrence. "You know that Starbucks on 5th? The one where they actually remember our names? There's this barista there, Margaret Grace. Beautiful, brilliant smile, works the morning shift." His smile turned cruel. "And she's black. Let's see how your family handles that at the country club." The words hung in the air like smoke, charged with all the ugly implications of old money and older prejudices. Several of the men shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Lawrence should have walked away, should have told Chad to go to hell, should have remembered everything his mother had taught him about respect and dignity. Instead, he found himself extending his hand. $5 million, he said, his voice steady despite the alcohol coursing through his veins. "Prepare to lose, Thompson." As they shook hands, Lawrence couldn't have known that this moment, born of pride, prejudice, and expensive whiskey, would become the pivot point of his entire life. He couldn't have known that somewhere across the city, Margaret Grace was closing up her last shift of the day, completely unaware that she had just become the centerpiece of a bet that would change both their lives forever. Neither of them could have predicted the storms that lay ahead, the lies, the love, the betrayal, and the shocking secrets that would unravel everything they thought they knew about each other. But that's the thing about life-changing moments. They rarely announce themselves. They slip in quietly, disguised as ordinary decisions, only revealing their true significance in retrospect. The bet was made, the wheels were set in motion, and somewhere in the grand tapestry of New York City's night, destiny smiled a knowing smile. The coffee shop encounter. The Starbucks on Fifth Avenue wasn't like any other in Manhattan. Housed in a restored Art Deco building, its interior boasted original brass fixtures and marble countertops that had witnessed nearly a century of New York's evolution. For Margaret Grace, it was more than just another coffee shop. It was her stage, her observatory, her temporary stepping stone to greater things. At 26, Margaret moved with the grace of someone who had mastered the delicate dance of city survival. Her hands crafted perfect lattes, while her mind rehearsed contract law, her Harvard law textbooks carefully hidden beneath the counter. The early morning shift suited her. It left her afternoons free for classes and her evenings for studying. But more than that, it let her observe humanity in all its caffeine-desperate glory. She'd learned to read people like books, the Wall Street wolves who treated ordering coffee like closing million-dollar deals, the aspiring actresses who counted every calorie in their skinny vanilla lattes, the tourists who photographed their drinks more than they consumed them. But nothing in her 3 years of people-watching had prepared her for Lawrence Norman. He first appeared on a Tuesday morning in October, when the air was crisp enough to turn breath into dragon smoke, and the leaves in Central Park were beginning their annual gold rush. Unlike the usual suit-clad executives, he waited patiently in line, his attention fixed on his phone, but his posture radiating old-money confidence. "Welcome to Starbucks," Margaret said when he reached the counter, her customer service smile firmly in place. "What can I get started for you?" He looked up then, and something flickered in his green eyes. Surprise, interest, or perhaps something else entirely. "I hear you make the best caramel macchiato in Manhattan," he said, his voice carrying that peculiar smoothness that came from expensive boarding schools and inherited privilege. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold claim. Who's your source?" "Let's call it insider trading," he replied with a hint of a smile. "I'm Lawrence." "I know," she said, already writing his name on the cup. "You're wearing a name tag from the Platinum Club conference across the street." She tapped her temple. "Details matter." He laughed then, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even him. "Observant. I like that. And you're—" "Margaret," she supplied, though her name tag made the introduction redundant. "Though my regulars call me Maggie." "Margaret," he repeated, deliberately ignoring the diminutive. "It suits you better, more regal." She fought the urge to roll her eyes. "That'll be $6.75. As she crafted his drink, she could feel his eyes on her, studying her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. Her hands moved with practiced precision, each step of the process muscle memory by now. "You're different," he said when she handed him the drink, "from the other baristas." "Because I'm black?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, sharp and challenging, but instead of flustering him, her directness seemed to intrigue him more. "Because you notice things, like name tags and insider trading jokes. Because you carry yourself like someone who's just passing through this world, not living in it permanently." For a moment, Margaret forgot her practiced customer service mask. "That's a lot to deduce from a coffee order." "I notice things too," he said simply, then took a sip of his drink. His eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "This actually is the best caramel macchiato I've ever had." "Told you so," she said, already turning to the next customer. "Have a nice day, Lawrence from the Platinum Club." He came back the next day, and the day after that. Each visit brought new conversations, brief exchanges that somehow managed to feel both superficial and meaningful at the same time. He never mentioned his family's wealth, though Margaret had Googled him after the third visit. The Norman name was everywhere: charity galas, business acquisitions, old money philanthropy. What puzzled her was his persistence. He never asked for her number, never made an obvious move. Instead, he seemed content to simply talk, to draw her out with clever observations and genuine questions. Against her better judgment, she found herself looking forward to their morning exchanges. Her co-worker, Jasmine, wasn't convinced. "Girl, men like that don't just randomly fall for baristas," she warned one morning while they were setting up. "He's either playing some game or treating you like his little charity project." Margaret wanted to disagree, but doubt had already taken root. She'd worked too hard, come too far to be anyone's social experiment. Her scholarship to Harvard Law hadn't come easy, and she'd learned early on that in her world, nothing was ever simply given without strings attached. Don't miss out on more thrilling stories. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join our storytelling family. Together, we bring fiction to life. But then came the morning when everything shifted. It was raining, the kind of heavy New York downpour that turned streets into rivers and umbrellas into useless accessories. Margaret's morning had been chaos. A broken umbrella, a delayed subway, and a line of irritable customers seeking refuge from the storm. Lawrence arrived later than usual, his usually impeccable suit slightly damp, carrying not one umbrella but two. Without ceremony, he placed the second one, a sleek black number that probably cost more than her weekly salary, on the counter. "I noticed yours was broken," he said simply, "and I figured you'd need one for after your shift." It wasn't the umbrella itself that caught her off guard. It was the fact that he'd noticed, that he'd thought about her comfort beyond their brief morning interactions, that he'd considered her life outside of these walls. "I can't accept this," she said, even as her fingers traced the umbrella's expensive handle. "Consider it a thank you for 6 weeks of perfect coffee," he replied. Then, before she could protest further, he added, "Have dinner with me." The words hung between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, trying to read his intentions in his eyes, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he seemed to be holding his breath, waiting for her answer. "Why me?" she asked finally. "And don't say it's because of my coffee." He smiled, but it wasn't his usual confident grin. This one held a touch of vulnerability. "Because you're the first person in years who didn't pretend to laugh at my jokes when they weren't funny. Because you treat everyone in line the same, whether they're wearing Prada or pajamas. Because I find myself thinking about our conversations long after they're over." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a wall beginning to crumble. "I get off at 4, she said finally, "but I need to change first. I smell like coffee beans." "I like coffee beans," he replied, his smile widening, "but take all the time you need. I'll be here." As he walked away, Margaret caught Jasmine's knowing look from across the counter. "Don't say it," she warned. "Wasn't gonna," Jasmine replied, but her expression spoke volumes. "Just remember, if something seems too good to be true." "It usually is," Margaret finished, watching Lawrence's retreating form through the rain-streaked windows. "I know." What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that her carefully constructed world was about to change forever. That this moment, this simple exchange of umbrellas and dinner invitations, would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and the price of happiness. The expensive umbrella sat on the counter between them, like a bridge between two worlds. His of unlimited wealth and privilege, hers of careful budgeting and hard-won achievements. Neither of them realized it was also the first thread in a tapestry of complications that would eventually unravel them both. Falling, despite herself, Margaret Grace had built her life on the foundation of careful calculations. Every decision, from working at Starbucks instead of taking a student loan to maintaining her 4.0 GPA at Harvard Law, had been meticulously planned. Love, especially the kind that came wrapped in designer suits and old money, had never been part of the equation. Their first date was at a hole-in-the-wall Ethiopian restaurant in Harlem, not the Michelin-starred establishments Lawrence usually frequented. When she suggested the place, she'd expected hesitation, maybe even polite deflection. Instead, his eyes had lit up with genuine curiosity. "I've never had Ethiopian food," he admitted, watching with fascination as she showed him how to eat with injera bread. "My culinary adventures usually stop at fusion sushi." "Well, Mr. Norman," she teased, "prepare to have your mind blown." The evening unfolded like a flower, each moment revealing new layers. He listened intently as she spoke about her childhood in Chicago, where her father taught literature at a community college and her mother ran a small bakery. He seemed genuinely impressed when she casually mentioned her full scholarship to Harvard Law, though she deliberately left out that she was in her final year. "Why work at Starbucks, then?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "With your credentials, you could intern at any law firm in the city." Margaret wiped her hands carefully on her napkin, considering her response. "Because making coffee lets me see people as they really are," she said finally. "How they treat service workers tells you everything about their character." Something flickered across his face. Was it guilt? But it disappeared so quickly she thought she might have imagined it. As weeks turned into months, their worlds began to blur at the edges. Lawrence introduced her to the symphony, and she took him to underground jazz clubs in Brooklyn. He showed her the view from his penthouse, and she taught him how to ride the subway. Each date was a careful dance of discovery, both of them stepping cautiously around the obvious disparities in their lives. Her friends were skeptical, especially Jasmine, who'd seen too many rich men treat love like a game. "Just be careful, Em," she warned one morning as they opened the shop. "Men like him, they sometimes slum it for fun before settling down with someone their mothers approve of." But Lawrence seemed different. He listened when she spoke about systemic inequality, actually listened instead of getting defensive. He asked questions about her experiences as a black woman in America, not with voyeuristic curiosity, but with a genuine desire to understand. The first time he kissed her, they were walking through Central Park at midnight, having spent hours talking at a 24-hour diner. Snow was falling, the first of the season, and the city had that magical quality it gets when weather forces even New York to slow down. "You have snowflakes in your hair," he said softly, reaching out to brush them away. His hand lingered on her cheek, warm against the cold night air. "You look like a winter goddess." "That's the corniest thing anyone's ever said to me," she laughed, but her heart was racing. "I'm serious," he insisted. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." When he kissed her, it felt like falling, like every romance novel cliché come to life, like something too good to be true. Their relationship progressed with the inevitability of a snowball rolling downhill. Each date, each kiss, each shared secret made it harder for Margaret to maintain her careful emotional distance. She found herself looking forward to his morning visits to Starbucks, missing him on the days when meetings kept him away. The first time they made love, it was in his penthouse with the city spread out below them like a carpet of stars. Afterward, as they lay tangled in his ridiculously expensive sheets, she traced the lines of his face with her finger. "What are we doing, Lawrence?" she whispered. "Really?" He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. "Falling in love, I think. Is that okay?" She wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that love could bridge the gulf between their worlds, but she'd seen too many movies, read too many books, where the rich guy and the poor girl lived happily ever after, only to find reality far less accommodating. "Your family," she started, but he cut her off with a kiss. "They'll love you," he insisted. "Once they get to know you, they'll see what I see." But when he finally took her to meet his family at their Hampton estate, reality came crashing in. His mother's smile never reached her eyes, and his father's handshake was politician perfect, warm on the surface, cold underneath. The servants, mostly people of colour, shot her looks that ranged from curiosity to pity. "So, Margaret," his mother said over dinner, crystal glasses tinkling like warning bells, "what does your family do?" "My father's a professor," she answered proudly, "and my mother owns a bakery." "How quaint," his mother replied, the word dripping with condescension. Later that night in the guest room, because of course they couldn't share a room, propriety must be maintained, Lawrence held her as she tried not to cry. "They'll come around," he promised. "They just need time." But time seemed to be working against them. Society columns began speculating about their relationship. Old money matrons whispered behind their hands at charity galas. Even the customers at Starbucks started treating her differently, some with newfound respect, others with barely concealed disdain. Despite it all, Margaret found herself falling deeper. Lawrence became her first thought in the morning, her last thought at night. She loved the way he looked at her when she spoke passionately about social justice, the way he always reached for her hand when they walked together, the way he seemed to see her, really see her, in a world that often rendered her invisible. But love, she was learning, wasn't just about grand gestures and perfect moments. It was about the small things too. Like how Lawrence never questioned why she kept working at Starbucks, even after they became serious. How he respected her independence, never trying to solve her problems with his money. How he stood up to his friends when they made subtle racist comments, even if it meant losing some of his social circle. 3 months into their relationship, as they sat on her tiny apartment's fire escape sharing takeout Chinese food, he said, "I love you." Simple, straightforward, like stating a fact about the weather. Margaret's chopsticks froze halfway to her mouth. "You can't," she said automatically. "Too late," he smiled. "Already do." She wanted to argue, to list all the reasons why this couldn't work. Their different backgrounds, their families' expectations, the looks they got when they walked down the street together. But instead, she heard herself say, "I love you too." The words felt like jumping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating at once. She was falling, had been falling since that first morning he walked into her coffee shop, and all her careful calculations couldn't save her now. What she didn't know then was that sometimes the hardest falls come when you think you've already hit bottom. That love, no matter how real, can be built on foundations of sand, and that the highest flights often lead to the most spectacular crashes. But in that moment, sharing cold noodles on a rusty fire escape, Margaret allowed herself to believe in fairy tales, just for a little while. The whirlwind romance. New York winters had a way of either bringing people together or tearing them apart. For Margaret and Lawrence, the city's harsh weather seemed to cocoon them in their own private world. Their courtship blazed through the cold months like a meteor, brilliant and unstoppable, leaving everyone in their orbit both dazzled and concerned. January found them making headlines in Page 6. Norman heir finds love over latte. The article was predictably sensational, filled with barely veiled racist undertones and classist speculation. Margaret's phone exploded with texts from old friends and distant relatives, all wanting to know if it was true. "We could sue for defamation," Lawrence offered, finding her crying over particularly vicious online comments one evening. "I have an army of lawyers." Margaret wiped her eyes, leaving smudges of mascara on her Harvard Law sweatshirt. "That would only make it worse. Besides," she managed a weak smile, "I'm going to be a lawyer myself. I'll fight my own battles." It was moments like these that made Lawrence fall even deeper. The way she faced adversity head-on, her unwavering dignity, her determination to stand on her own feet. He'd grown up in a world where problems were solved with checkbooks and connections. Margaret's strength was something entirely different, something real. The proposal came during a blizzard in February, barely 3 months into their relationship. They were trapped in her tiny apartment in Harlem, the heating barely working, wrapped in every blanket she owned. Lawrence had insisted on staying instead of retreating to his climate-controlled penthouse, claiming he wanted to experience a real New York winter emergency. "You're insane," Margaret laughed, watching him attempt to make hot chocolate on her temperamental stove. "You could be sipping champagne in your heated marble palace right now." "But then I'd miss seeing you in those ridiculous fuzzy socks," he replied, gesturing to her feet, where 3 pairs of multicolored socks made her look like she had cartoon character feet. "These socks are a family heirloom, I'll have you know. My grandmother knitted them." "Really?" "No, I got them on sale at Target." She grinned. "But they're still precious to me." He looked at her then, really looked at her, taking in her messy bun, her oversized sweater, those ridiculous socks. In that moment, surrounded by the howling wind and the soft glow of emergency candles, he knew. "Marry me." Margaret almost dropped her mug. "What? Marry me," he repeated more firmly this time. "I know it's fast. I know everyone will say we're crazy, but I don't care. I love you, Margaret Grace. I love your brilliant mind, your kind heart, your terrible taste in socks. I love how you make me see the world differently. I love that you challenge me to be better. I want to build a life with you." "Lawrence," she started, her voice shaking. "Wait," he interrupted, fumbling in his pocket. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. But maybe there is no perfect moment. Maybe perfect is right here, in your freezing apartment, with you looking at me like I've lost my mind." The ring he pulled out was nothing like the massive rocks his social circle favored. Instead, it was elegant and understated. A vintage Art Deco piece with a modest but flawless diamond surrounded by tiny sapphires. "It was my grandmother's," he explained, "the only person in my family who married for love instead of social standing. My mother wanted me to give it to whoever I eventually married, probably hoping it would be someone more suitable. But I think my grandmother would have loved you." Margaret stared at the ring, then at Lawrence, then back at the ring. Her law school training kicked in, making her analyze every angle, every potential outcome. It was too fast, too risky. Too many things could go wrong. "Your family will disown you," she whispered. "Let them. Society will talk. Let them talk. I'm not giving up law school. I'd never ask you to. I want to keep working at Starbucks until graduation. I'll be your most loyal customer." She took a deep breath. "The hot chocolate is burning." Lawrence cursed, rushing to save their drinks. When he turned back, Margaret was smiling through tears. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you, you crazy, impulsive, wonderful man." The wedding plans became a battlefield of expectations. Lawrence's mother pushed for a society event at the plaza, with hundreds of guests and press coverage. Margaret's parents advocated for a simple church ceremony in Chicago. In the end, they compromised by having 2 ceremonies. A small, intimate wedding in Margaret's childhood church, followed by a lavish reception in New York that satisfied the social obligations of the Norman name. The Chicago ceremony was everything Margaret had dreamed of. Her father walked her down the aisle of the same church where she'd been baptized. Her mother's red velvet cake took center stage at the reception in the church hall. Lawrence's parents attended, but looked comically out of place among the working-class guests, their designer clothes and perfect postures marking them as visitors from another world. The New York reception was a different beast entirely. Held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, closed to the public for the occasion, it was a who's who of Manhattan's elite. Old money mingled with new, politicians rubbed shoulders with celebrities, and everyone watched with barely concealed fascination as Lawrence Norman, scion of one of New York's oldest families, danced with his beautiful black bride. "They're all waiting for us to fail," Margaret whispered during their first dance, her white Vera Wang gown swirling around them. "Then let's disappoint them," Lawrence replied, pulling her closer. "We'll show them what real love looks like." The society pages had a field day. "Norman heir weds in controversial ceremony," read one headline. "Love conquers class divide," declared another, more sympathetic outlet. Photos of their wedding dance appeared in magazines, some celebrating their love story, others using it as a symbol of society's changing dynamics. Their honeymoon was a month-long tour of Europe, staying in castles and luxury hotels. Margaret insisted on visiting local courthouses in each country, fascinated by different legal systems. Lawrence found her enthusiasm endearing, even when she spent their romantic Paris evening discussing French civil law. They returned to New York in spring, moving into a brownstone in Brooklyn that represented their own compromise. Prestigious enough for Lawrence's image, but in a diverse neighborhood that made Margaret feel at home. She continued her final year at Harvard Law, commuting to Cambridge 3 days a week, while maintaining her early morning shifts at Starbucks. "You don't have to work anymore," Lawrence would say sometimes, watching her set her alarm for 4 a.m. "I know," she'd reply, kissing him softly, "but I want to. It keeps me grounded." For 6 months they lived in a bubble of newlywed bliss. They hosted dinner parties where Margaret's law school friends mixed with Lawrence's social circle, creating unlikely friendships. They spent weekends exploring different neighborhoods, trying hole-in-the-wall restaurants, and making plans for their future. They talked about children, agreeing to wait until Margaret finished law school and established her career. They discussed opening a chain of high-end coffee shops that would provide scholarships for employees. They dreamed of changing the world together, using their combined strengths to make a difference. But dreams, like bubbles, are fragile things. And sometimes the biggest threats come not from outside forces, but from the secrets we keep from those we love most. Neither of them could have known that their perfect love story was built on a foundation of lies, that a drunken bet made months ago would come back to haunt them. That trust, once broken, is the hardest thing to repair. But for now, in their Brooklyn brownstone, surrounded by wedding gifts they hadn't yet unpacked and dreams they hadn't yet realized, they were happy. Truly, completely, blindly happy. The truth comes out. It was a crisp October morning when Margaret's world imploded, the kind of autumn day that usually made her fall in love with New York all over again, with leaves dancing on Central Park winds and sunlight painting the city gold. She was in her last semester at Harvard Law, juggling finals preparation with her early morning Starbucks shifts, when the text message arrived. Unknown number. "Congratulations on making it to the 6-month mark. Lawrence must be counting down the days until he collects his $5 million. Wonder what the going rate is for marrying a barista these days." At first, she thought it was just another racist troll, the kind she'd learned to ignore since her relationship with Lawrence went public. But then came the screenshots, dozens of them. A group chat from the night at the Platinum Club. Pictures of Lawrence and his friends, drunk and laughing. The bet, spelled out in excruciating detail. 5 million says you can't marry the black barista and keep her for a year. Make it interesting. She has to think it's real. Done. Easiest money I'll ever make. Timer starts when you say "I do." Her hands shook so violently that she dropped her phone, the screen cracking against the marble counter of their kitchen. 6 months. They'd been married exactly 6 months. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Memories started realigning themselves like puzzle pieces, showing a different picture entirely. How he'd appeared at Starbucks that first morning, his persistence, the whirlwind romance, the proposal during the blizzard. All of it, every precious moment she'd treasured, had been orchestrated for a bet. She read through the screenshots again and again, each word burning itself into her brain. Chad Thompson, Lawrence's supposed nemesis, had been the one to suggest her specifically. The pretty black barista who works mornings, that'll really get under his family's skin. Margaret ran to the bathroom and threw up, her grandmother's ring catching the light as she gripped the toilet bowl. The ring that supposedly represented true love in the Norman family. Another lie. She called in sick to both work and school, something she'd never done before. Then she started packing, moving on autopilot. Designer clothes Lawrence had bought her went into donation bags. Her own modest wardrobe went into her old suitcases. Her law books, her personal photos, her life before Lawrence, all carefully sorted and packed. But when she reached for their wedding album, her composure finally broke. The photos showed such joy, such genuine love, or what she'd thought was love. There they were, dancing at their reception, looking at each other like they were the only two people in the world. Had he been acting then? Was he that good a liar, or had she been that desperate to believe? Her phone kept buzzing, more screenshots from the unknown number. 6 months down, 6 to go. Man, I can't believe she fell for it. The look on his mum's face when he brought her home was worth every penny. She turned off her phone. The sun was setting when Lawrence finally came home, whistling as he walked through the door. He was carrying takeout from her favorite Ethiopian restaurant, probably planning another cozy night in. "Honey, why is it so dark in here?" he called out, flicking on lights. "Margaret?" She sat in their living room, surrounded by packed bags, their wedding album open on her lap. When he saw her, he froze. "What's wrong? What happened?" She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. $5 million. The color drained from his face. "What?" "That's what I was worth to you. $5 million to marry the black barista, keep her for a year, make her fall in love. Was it worth it, Lawrence? Did you calculate the hourly rate for pretending to love me?" "Margaret, I can explain." "Explain what?" She stood up, hurling the wedding album at him. Photos scattered across the floor like confetti. "Explain how you and your rich friends treated my life like a game. How you bet on whether you could fool me into loving you. It wasn't like that." He stepped toward her, but she backed away. "Yes, the bet happened. Yes, that's how it started. But everything changed. What we have is real." "Real?" She laughed, a hollow sound that scared them both. "Real is what I felt. Real is how I defended you to my friends when they said you were too good to be true. Real is how I thought I'd finally found someone who saw me for who I am, not what I look like or where I come from. I do see you." "No," she cut him off. "You saw a bet, a challenge, a chance to prove something to your friends. God, I feel so stupid. Everyone warned me, even your mother. At least she was honest about her racism. But you were worse. You made me believe in fairy tales." She picked up her bags, hands steady now. All her tears had dried up, leaving nothing but cold fury. "Margaret, please," his voice broke. "I love you. That part is real. It became real somewhere along the way. The bet doesn't matter anymore. I'll give the money to charity, all of it. We can start fresh." She turned to him one last time. "You know what's funny? I was going to tell you tonight. I got my final exam results early. I'm graduating Harvard Law at the top of my class." "That's right. Your little barista experiment is actually a lawyer. I kept it secret because I wanted to prove I could make it on my own, that I wasn't with you for your money or connections. Ironic, isn't it? The shock on his face would have been comical in any other situation. "I've already called a divorce. Lawyer, don't try to find me. Don't try to explain. Just let me go." "Margaret, wait." He reached for her, but she stepped aside. "Congratulations, Lawrence. You won the bet. You made the black barista fall in love with you. I hope the money helps you sleep at night." She walked out into the October evening, leaving behind the life she'd thought was a dream come true. Behind her, she could hear him calling her name, his voice echoing through their neighborhood like a ghost. What he didn't know, what she didn't tell him, was that she wasn't just leaving with her broken heart and her law degree. She was leaving with something that would bind them together forever, whether she wanted it or not. Their child, barely 8 weeks along, growing inside her like a secret she wasn't ready to share. The shocking revelation. Margaret sat in her new apartment in Boston, staring at 2 objects that represented her shattered world: divorce papers and a sonogram picture. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd just been hired by one of Boston's top law firms, graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law, and here she was, becoming a statistic. Pregnant, soon to be divorced, and heartbroken. The apartment was a far cry from her Brooklyn brownstone, a studio on the 17th floor of a concrete high-rise, with views of the harbor that she could barely afford on her starting lawyer's salary, but it was hers, untainted by lies and betrayal. Her phone had 47 missed calls from Lawrence. She'd blocked his number, but he kept finding new ways to reach her. Burner phones, different numbers, even attempt to contact through mutual friends. His latest voicemail played in her head. "Margaret, please. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but there's something you need to know. The bet. It wasn't just about you. I made a counter bet that day. I bet my entire inheritance, everything, that I could find true love with someone my family wouldn't approve of. I wanted to prove that love could cross all boundaries. Yes, it started wrong, but what we have is real. Please just talk to me." She deleted the message, like all the others. The morning sickness was getting worse. Every dawn brought a new wave of nausea, a physical reminder of the life growing inside her. Her new colleagues attributed her pale complexion to first-year associate stress. If only they knew. 3 weeks after she'd left New York, Chad Thompson appeared at her office. He walked in wearing a $10,000 suit and a guilty conscience. "He's destroying himself," Chad said without preamble. "He's given away most of his fortune to charitable causes, black education initiatives, minority business loans, women's shelters. His family's threatening to have him committed." "Get out," Margaret said coldly, hand hovering over the security button. "Wait," Chad pulled out his phone. "You need to see this. The real bet wasn't what you think." The video showed that night at the Platinum Club from a different angle. After the initial bet was made, it showed Lawrence staying behind, writing something on a legal pad. "I, Lawrence Norman, hereby bet my entire inheritance against Chad Thompson's $5 million that I will find true love with Margaret Grace, and that love will transcend all social, racial, and economic barriers. If I fail to find real love, I forfeit everything to charity." The paper was dated, signed, and notarized the next morning. "He gave himself only one way to win," Chad explained, "by actually falling in love. The marriage part was my bet, but his counter-bet was about real love. He risked everything on you." Margaret felt the room spin. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm the one who sent you those screenshots," Chad admitted. "I was about to lose $5 million. I thought if I broke you up, the bet would be void. I didn't show you the whole truth. I didn't show you how he fought with his family for you, how he changed his whole worldview, how he's been working with civil rights organizations since meeting you." She gripped her desk, fighting another wave of nausea. "Get out. He doesn't know I'm here," Chad continued. "He doesn't know I'm the one who sent those texts. But you should know, he's using his law team to track down who did it. And when he finds out it was me, he shrugged. Well, I probably deserve whatever's coming. After he left, Margaret ran to the bathroom and threw up. When she emerged, her assistant handed her an envelope that had just been delivered. Inside was a letter from Lawrence's grandmother, the one who'd given him the engagement ring. My dear Margaret, I'm 92 years old, and I've seen enough of the world to know that true love is rare. What my grandson did was wrong, starting a relationship on a bet, but I've watched him these past months. I've seen how he looks at you, how he changed his entire life to be worthy of you. The ring I gave him wasn't just any family heirloom. It was given to me by my husband, a Jew, and my family disowned me for marrying in 1950. They said it would never work. Different religions, different backgrounds. We were married 51 years before he passed. Lawrence is like his grandfather. When he loves completely. He's donated his entire trust fund to establish scholarships for minority students. He's living in a one-bedroom apartment, working pro bono for civil rights cases. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you to remember that love, real love, often comes in imperfect packages. And my dear, I suspect you're not just carrying the burden of a broken heart. A grandmother knows these things. Whatever you decide, know that this child will be loved by you and by our family, if you'll let us. With love, Eleanor Norman. Margaret's hands shook as she read the letter again. Her other hand instinctively went to her stomach, where their child grew stronger each day. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Norman heir renounces fortune, establishes minority scholarship fund. The article showed a picture of Lawrence, unshaven and tired-looking, standing outside a community center in Harlem. Another wave of nausea hit her, but this time it wasn't morning sickness. It was the realization that the truth, like love, was more complicated than she'd thought. She picked up her phone, hovering over Lawrence's blocked number. Their child deserved to know the whole truth. About the bet, about the counter-bet, about love that started with a lie but grew into something real. Her finger trembled over the unblock button. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest risk isn't falling in love. It's giving love a second chance. A risk worth taking. Margaret paced her tiny apartment, the weight of Eleanor's words and Chad's confession pressing heavily on her chest. She set her phone down and stared out at the Boston harbor. The sunlight danced on the water, reminding her of the way Lawrence's eyes used to light up when he talked about building something meaningful, something beyond his family's shadow. She pressed her hand against her stomach, feeling a pang of connection to the life she carried. Their child deserved clarity, closure, and perhaps a chance at a family. Margaret closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and unblocked Lawrence's number. Within moments, her phone rang. His name flashed on the screen. "Hello?" Her voice was steady, though her heart was racing. "Margaret?" Lawrence's voice cracked, heavy with emotion. I didn't think you'd ever speak to me again." "This isn't about us," she said firmly. "It's about the truth, and the child I'm carrying." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "You're pregnant?" "Yes." His exhale was audible, almost like a sob. I don't know what to say." "You can start by explaining why I had to find out about the counterbet from Chad," she said, her tone sharp, "and why you've been hiding the truth all this time." "I didn't think you'd believe me," he admitted. "And honestly, after what I did, I didn't think I deserved for you to believe me." "That's not your decision to make, Lawrence. You're right." His voice was heavy with regret. "You're absolutely right. I let fear guide me, and I've been paying for it every day since you left. I tried to fix things, but nothing I do will ever undo the pain I caused you." Margaret hesitated, her grip tightening on the phone. "Why did you make that counterbet in the first place? Was it all some elaborate way to make yourself feel better about what you did?" "No," he said quickly. "It wasn't about that. I've spent my whole life doing what my family expected of me, fitting into their mold, living for their approval. But when I met you, Margaret, you made me question everything. I knew they wouldn't approve of you, because of your background, because of your strength, because you're everything they're not. And I wanted to prove, not just to them, but to myself, that love could be real, that it didn't have to fit their narrow, elitist definition. She felt tears sting her eyes. And yet, you still made me a bet. You still gambled with my life, my trust. I did, he said softly, and I've regretted it every day since. But Margaret, the love I feel for you, it's not a gamble. It never was. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you, whether you take me back or not. The sincerity in his voice was disarming. But Margaret wasn't ready to let her guard down just yet. Lawrence, I'm not sure I can ever trust you again. And trust is the foundation of everything. Without it, there's no love, no future. I know, he said, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild that trust, even if it means stepping back and letting you live your life without me. I just want what's best for you and for our child. The vulnerability in his words cracked something inside her. For months, she'd been carrying the weight of betrayal, anger, and heartbreak. But now, hearing him so open and raw, she felt a glimmer of something else. Hope. Lawrence, she said after a long pause, I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were, but for the sake of this child, I'm willing to start with honesty. If you want to be a part of their life, you need to earn that place, not with grand gestures or donations, but with consistency and truth. I'll do whatever it takes, he promised, even if it takes a lifetime. We'll see, she said quietly. 2 weeks later, they met at a small cafe in Cambridge. Lawrence looked different, thinner, more tired, but also more grounded. He carried no trace of the entitled arrogance that had once defined him. As Margaret walked in, he stood, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. You look beautiful, he said softly. She ignored the comment, sitting across from him. This isn't about us, Lawrence. It's about what kind of parents we can be for this child. I understand, he said, and I'm ready to listen. For hours they talked about the past, the present, and the future. Lawrence answered her questions with unflinching honesty, never once trying to excuse his actions. By the time they left, Margaret still wasn't sure if she could trust him, but she saw a man willing to fight for redemption, not for himself, but for her and their unborn child. As they stood outside the cafe, Lawrence hesitated. Margaret, can I ask you one thing? What? Would you let me take you to your next doctor's appointment? I want to be there, for both of you. She looked at him for a long moment, her heart warring with her mind. Finally, she nodded. One step at a time, Lawrence. A small, hopeful smile broke across his face. One step at a time. And for the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could be worth the risk. A fragile truce. The day of the doctor's appointment arrived faster than Margaret anticipated. She was nervous, not about the checkup itself, but about seeing Lawrence again in such an intimate setting. It felt strange, letting him back into her life, even in this small way, but she reminded herself this wasn't about her feelings. It was about the baby. Lawrence arrived early, standing outside the clinic with a nervous energy that was almost endearing. He wore a simple sweater and jeans, so unlike the polished suits she'd always seen him in. When he saw her approach, his face softened, but he didn't push for conversation. "Thank you for letting me be here," he said as they walked in together. Margaret gave him a curt nod, clutching her bag tightly. "Let's just focus on the baby." The ultrasound room was dimly lit, with a monitor positioned next to the bed. Margaret lay back as the technician applied the gel to her abdomen. Lawrence stood awkwardly at the side, his hands in his pockets, unsure of where to look. And then the sound, A steady, rapid heartbeat filled the room. "That's your baby," the technician said, smiling. She moved the wand, and the outline of a tiny, wriggling form appeared on the screen. "Everything looks great. Strong heartbeat, good growth. You're about 16 weeks along." Margaret's breath caught. It was one thing to know she was pregnant, but seeing the baby, their baby, felt overwhelming. She blinked back tears, stealing a glance at Lawrence. He was transfixed, his eyes locked on the screen. "That's our baby," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's real." The technician smiled knowingly. "It always feels more real when you see it. Would you like pictures?" Margaret nodded, unable to speak. She felt Lawrence's hand brush hers, and for a brief moment she didn't pull away. The connection, however fragile, was there. Later, as they stood outside the clinic, Lawrence broke the silence. "Thank you for letting me be part of that. I don't have words." Margaret glanced at him, her walls still up but slightly lower than before. "It's not about you, Lawrence. It's about doing what's right for this child." "I know," he said quickly, "but I want to do what's right for you too. I know I can't fix the past, but I want to be here, for both of you, even if it's just as a co-parent." The sincerity in his voice made her pause. "We'll see," she said finally. "Actions speak louder than words." Over the next few weeks, Lawrence began to show her just how serious he was. He attended parenting classes, read books about fatherhood, and even started volunteering at a local community center. He didn't boast about these efforts or try to use them to win her back. Instead, he quietly showed up consistently and without expectation. Margaret couldn't ignore the change. He was no longer the spoiled, arrogant man she'd married. He was becoming someone she could almost imagine trusting again. But trust wasn't built overnight. One evening, Lawrence showed up at her apartment with a small, carefully wrapped gift. "It's not much," he said, handing it to her, "but I thought you might like it." Inside was a simple baby blanket, hand-knitted in soft, neutral colors. "I didn't make it," he admitted with a sheepish smile. "But I found a local group that does these for single mothers. I've been volunteering there." Margaret's heart softened despite herself. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It's thoughtful." Lawrence hesitated, then said, "I know I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I'm sorry, Margaret, for everything, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I'm not the man who hurt you." She met his gaze, seeing the weight of his guilt and the depth of his resolve. "Lawrence," she said after a long pause, "you're doing all the right things. But this isn't just about what you do. It's about how I feel, and I'm not there yet." "I understand," he said. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." As the weeks turned into months, their fragile truce began to evolve. They worked together to prepare for the baby's arrival, attending doctor's appointments, setting up a nursery, and learning how to co-parent. Lawrence was careful not to overstep, giving Margaret space while still being present. Slowly, Margaret began to see glimpses of the man she'd fallen in love with, the man who, despite his flaws, had a good heart. And though she wasn't ready to forgive him completely, she couldn't deny that he was becoming someone she could envision a future with. The night before their baby shower, Lawrence stayed late to help assemble a crib. As they worked side by side, Margaret caught him watching her with a look of quiet admiration. "What?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Nothing," he said, smiling softly. "Just thank you for giving me the chance to be here." She didn't respond, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, love was worth the risk after all. A new beginning. The day their daughter was born, the world seemed to pause. Margaret cradled the tiny bundle in her arms, tears streaming down her face as the baby's soft cries filled the hospital room. She glanced over at Lawrence, who sat by her side, overwhelmed and speechless. His hands trembled as he reached out, gently touching their daughter's impossibly small fingers. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. In that moment, the weight of their past seemed to fade, replaced by the awe of this tiny life they had brought into the world. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was something just as powerful, a chance to start anew. They named her Grace, a tribute to the resilience, strength, and hope that had carried them through the storm. As the nurse left them alone, Lawrence looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "I know I've said it 100 times, but thank you for this chance, for this family. I'll never take it for granted." Margaret met his gaze, seeing not the man who had hurt her, but the man who had grown, changed, and proven his love through actions, not just words. "Lawrence," she said softly, "this isn't about forgetting the past. It's about building something better, together." He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I'll spend every day doing just that. For you, for Grace, for us." As they sat together watching their daughter sleep, Margaret realized that love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about grand gestures or flawless beginnings. Love was messy, complicated, and often born out of pain, but it was also resilient, transformative, and capable of healing even the deepest wounds. She reached out, taking Lawrence's hand in hers. "We'll take it one step at a time," she said. "One step at a time," he agreed, his voice steady with determination. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the window, illuminating their little family, Margaret felt a quiet certainty settle over her heart. Theirs was not a story of perfect love, but of love that had fought to survive, a love that had been tested, broken, and rebuilt stronger than before. Sometimes the most beautiful endings aren't endings at all, they're beginnings. And so they began again, with Grace,